Welcome to the 38th webinar series from the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, also called NERPS, and a seminar from the IDEC Institute at Hiroshima University. I am Leticia dos Muchangos, a specially appointed associate professor at Hiroshima University and a NERPS core member. Thank you for joining us. Please note that this session is being recorded, and today we have another insightful session on the nexus between peace and sustainability. And before we begin, I will quickly review the setup. We will start with a 30 minutes presentation from our esteemed speaker, Dr. Sara Balestri, an assistant professor of economic policy at University of Perugia. And then, for the very first time, we will be joined by a discussant in this webinar, and we are pleased to welcome today Dr. Mitchell Austin, an assistant professor at Hiroshima University, who will speak for approximately 15 minutes, followed by an open discussion with the participants for an additional 15 minutes. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation. And of course, for burning questions and questions that you don't want to forget, please use the chat box to write those, which later you're free to voice them, or we can do it on your behalf. So without further ado, please, Professor Balestri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leticia, for your words and invitation. Let me share my screen. Okay, I think you can see my screen. That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start. As you said, this talk is about the link between climate change, vulnerability to climate, and the civil conflict. And this is an urgent topic which has received a renewed attention during the last decade. And this is due to two main reasons. First, the number of civil conflict is on the rise again, especially in some regions such as sub-Saharan Africa. So understanding the drivers of this growing violence is an issue. And the second, the climate impacts are becoming more frequent and less predictable. So human insecurity risks are increasing, particularly among the most vulnerable populations. So, for example, in rural areas, climate change is reshaping rural livelihoods, compromising agricultural productivity, food security, and economic stability. So, here you see, for example, some information coming from the UCDP data. UCDP is one of the most used sources of data about civil conflict in the empirical literature. And as you can see, in recent years, the number of civil conflicts, that is intrastate conflicts in light blue, has increased a lot, dramatically, and very interestingly, a relevant share of this conflict is represented by internationalized internal conflicts. So that is conflicts involving international actors or involving areas in neighboring countries. And I think that this graph alone explains the urgency of studying civil conflicts. So let's go back to the initial point, to the initial question. Is there a relationship between this recent increase in violence and the effects of climate change? The attention to these phenomena has given space to a very fast-growing literature on this topic, and you see on the chart the growing number of studies that for example, have been identified by Burke et al. In a very recent review of the literature, this huge increasing number of studies about the climate change conflict nexus. And there is a key aspect to be noted here. While initially studies investigated the existence of a direct connection between climate change and conflict, more recently the idea is that the connection exists, but it is indirect. So in other words, it's not the increase in average temperatures per se that generates conflict, but rather it's the impact that such an increase has, for instance, on agricultural production and livelihoods. So it is the induced reduction of these elements, agricultural production, for example, that can make conflict more likely. So from a general standpoint of view, empirical research has pointed out that climate variability and climate change may influence the risk of violent conflict, of armed conflict. However, this relationship remains complex, indirect, as we were saying, and highly context dependent. And these lead to diverse effects with the countries. So we observe countries which are subject to very similar impacts of climate change, but they are experiencing different stories in terms of civil conflicts. In addition, the use of different research designs and datasets and methods of analysis results in diverging findings in literature. So the results we have are somehow heterogeneous and not consistent. And finally, there is uncertainty about the temporal dimension, because studies tend to focus on short-term variations or extreme events such as droughts or floods, and they use these extreme events or variations as a proxy for climate change. And it makes perfectly sense because these kind of events are immediately observable. We can measure them. But on the other hand, the slow and cumulative evolution of the effects of climate change often escapes our ability to measure it. This chart represents, I think, quite well this heterogeneity of results. This comes from a paper published in Nature in 2019, in which a group of 11 experts, which is a sample of the top experts and most cited scholars on this topic, on the climate change conflict nexus, participated in individual and group interviews, and then the transcripts of these interviews were analyzed, and through an iteration methods of analysis, they have been transformed into subjective probabilistic judgments on the conflict risk as related to climate. And as you can see, there are many differences you see here on the vertical axis between individual perspectives. And these differences merely refer to the role that socioeconomic and institutional factors have in explaining the link between climate change and violence. Then there is a further complication, which refers to what we consider as a conflict, because there is not a unique definition of what is meant by the word conflict, so that different databases may apply different operational definitions and thresholds to record events such as conflict or not conflict. And even if we focus on intergroup violence, we see many different kinds of events. For example, in a very famous paper by Kubi in 2019, the author highlights that scholars have a focus on different kinds of events in analyzing the connection between climate change and conflicts. However, there are some elements of broad consensus on this literature. The first one is that the causal relationship linking climate change and conflict, if exists, is not entirely clear, but there is certainly a systematic association between climate change and conflict. Second, very important, is that today climate change is considered as a threat multiplier. So it does not directly cause conflict, as we were saying before, but it is able to exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and tensions that can lead to instability, violence, even war, and this is true especially in fragile and resource-stressed regions. In this perspective, the agri-food sector plays a central role because it is both highly vulnerable to climate impacts, and at the same time, it is also deeply embedded in social, economic, and environmental systems that can drive or prevent conflict if they are resilient. So this centrality of the agri-food sector is a clear evidence coming from a yet unpublished review of the literature on this topic where I am involved in, and I will give you some details later. It is also clear that a conflict tends to increase the vulnerability of a country to climate change, increasing its impacts also in terms of instability. And this is very important because vicious cycles can be created, real traps with mechanisms that feed themselves. So what is the role of the agri-food sector? As I was saying with some colleagues from the University of Florence and the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, both placed in Italy, we are working on a research project that you see mentioned here, which is based on the role of the agri-food sector in explaining the link between climate change and conflict. And here you have also the link to visit the website. A lot of resources are uploaded on this website. So if you are interested on this topic, you may find interesting to have a look at the website. So essentially, we have identified two main pathways through which climate change can lead to conflict through the agri-food sector. The first one is the resource availability competition channel, and the second, the reduced agricultural productivity channel. So two different pathways leading to more likely conflict. The first one refers to the induced scarcity of renewable resources, such as water, land, and pastures, which increases pressures over them and worsen tensions to have access to these resources. And the second pathway refers to the reduction in agricultural productivity, because as climate conditions deteriorate, crop yields and livestock productivity decline, and this is a direct threat to the livelihoods of those who are dependent on agriculture, because they experience even a huge income loss and very often increasing market prices. So basically, in this situation, the opportunity cost for farmers, for pastoralists, the opportunity cost of joining a rebellion, of being engaged in a conflict, decreases. So it is more likely that these kind of groups tend to mobilize. And there are two other aspects to be cited. The first one is migration and displacement, which can characterize both pathways, worsening their effects. And the second, the existence of these feedback loops that tend to worsen the degree of vulnerability to climate change, and therefore the impacts of climate change on the agri-food system and the likelihood of conflict. So once again, these self-reinforcing mechanism that can be at play. One way to focus on the impact of climate change through these pathways is restricting the analysis to a specific kind of violence, which is called communal violence. And this term refers to armed bands involving non-state groups that are organized along collective identity lines, such as ethnic or tribal. So these are groups not organized on a permanent basis for combat, and rather they mobilize when they perceive that their livelihoods or identity is in danger. And their livelihoods are mainly based on land and land-related resources. We can think, for example, about Turkana or Pokot groups in Kenya, or to think about communal violence, we can cite the frequent clashes between herders and pastoralists in the Sahel region, for example. So communal violence is likely to rise because of intergroup increased competition over livelihoods means, and climate change can have a role exactly on this point. So this is the reason why many scholars have decided to focus on this specific form of violence. And I would like to briefly discuss with you a paper. Here you have the full reference, exactly about the role of vulnerability to climate change on communal violence. So, what is the main aim of this paper? This paper was meant at exploring how variations in vulnerability to climate hazards affect the likelihood and severity of communal violence. Severity means the number of events, so the cumulative number of events of communal violence. And we account for socioeconomic factors that might influence this relationship. We decided to focus on Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, since these are regions particularly exposed to climate effects, and they are both dominantly characterized by rain-fed and climate-sensitive agriculture. At the same time, they are also characterized by very different social-political structures. So on the one hand, we have very common characteristics, and on the other, some differences, which helps us distinguishing possible regional specific patterns and it allows us disentangling conditional effects of climate variability on communal violence. So some information about communal violence on these regions. Here you see plotted the number of events defined as communal violence according to the UCD definition. And you see that there are many differences between the two regions. In sub-Saharan Africa, there is recorded the highest number of this kind of events at the global level. Nevertheless, Asian countries report multiple and deadly events which deserve to be explored in a more extensive way. And the Southeast Asia is really poorly covered by this kind of studies. We can make several examples of this kind of violence in Southeast Asia. For instance, the proliferation of ethnic insurgent groups in the northeastern of India during the 90s, which led to widespread conflicts, mainly focused on land and identity issues, which generated thousands of fatalities and internally displaced people. So we focus on these two regions and we use as a measure of vulnerability an aggregate index elaborated by the Notre Dame University, which is called ND-GAIN, and this index is in line with the main pillars defined by the IPCC in defining climate change. So these pillars are the exposure of a country to climate change, the sensitivity of a territory, and the adaptive capacity of a country to face the effects of climate change. Across 6 life supporting sectors, these 3 dimensions are measured and then aggregate in a composite index. I do not want to go through the technical details of the paper, but I will answer to all your questions, if any, at the end of this presentation. I think the most important thing here is to say something about the research hypothesis and the structure of the analysis. So we have 2 main research hypotheses. The first one is that a higher degree of vulnerability to climate change increases the precariousness of traditional livelihoods, and the insecurity coming from this effect reduces the opportunity cost of mobilizing groups to secure their preservation. So this makes the likelihood of communal violence higher. And as a second hypothesis, we have that since we expect that vulnerability is a driver of communal violence outbreak, the persistence of such fragility condition acts as a co-driver in explaining also the persistence of this phenomenon, so the total number of events, the severity of communal violence. And we analyze this issue through 2 stages analysis. First, through a descriptive analysis of the correlation pattern between the incidence of communal violence and vulnerability, and then through an empirical analysis of the likelihood and severity. Descriptive results. Some insights from these very different regions. So here we have sub-Saharan Africa, and with the darkest shades of red, you see where the vulnerability score is higher. So you can see that vulnerability is higher in the Sahel region and basically in the Middle and Eastern Africa. The cycles are proportional to the absolute number of reported events of communal violence. So from these chart, we already see some meaningful association between vulnerability to climate change and communal violence. On the box plot to the right, you see the comparison between countries experiencing communal conflict in green and those not experiencing this kind of violence in blue. And you see what is the difference on average of the vulnerability score during the period of observation, which ranges from 1995 to 2021. And you see that basically in East Africa and Middle Africa, where communal conflict occurs, the average level of vulnerability is higher with respect to those countries not having this kind of experience. When we come to Southeast Asia, we see something different, or at least not totally in line with what we found in Sub-Saharan Africa. Here, the association is still present, but not so evident. So we have, for example, countries such as Indonesia with lower score of vulnerability and still a high number of events of communal violence. Looking at the box plot, you see the two sub-regions of South Asia and Southeast Asia, and you see that in both cases, vulnerability score is more or less the same if the country is experiencing communal conflict or not. So not a clear difference on this dimension. What about the empirical results? Here, three elements deserve to be noted. The first one is that vulnerability is consistently significant in explaining the likelihood of communal violence in Sub-Saharan Africa, whereas there is no significance in Southeast Asia. This is the result of the baseline. We have many other regressions with additional controls, subsamples, etc. And these results are really consistent. What is driving communal violence in Southeast Asia? Well, the most powerful variable associated with this event is represented by negative rainfall deviations. So basically, this is a measure of climate variability, short-term variability. And the results suggest that wetter years are associated with a reduction in communal violence, which makes sense because in Southeast Asia, also recent FAO estimates says that more than 65% of agriculture is rain-fed agriculture. A last point to be noted is the role of per capita agricultural land that we use as a proxy for livelihoods means for people living in rural areas. As you can see, this variable is associated with the significant coefficient in both Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia with a reduction of communal violence. This is the projection of the probabilities of communal violence outbreak in Sub-Saharan Africa according to different levels of vulnerability. And you can see that there is this increasing function describing the probabilities of conflict outbreak according to increasing levels of vulnerability. The vertical red line indicates the average vulnerability score of Sub-Saharan Africa during the period of observation, but there are some cases with much higher levels than this one, for example, Chad, which is close to 0.65. What about the severity of violence? Also, in this case, we found results in line with what I have already described, with the vulnerability significant just in sub-Saharan Africa, and livelihood means significant for both regions. So, some conclusions about this exercise, this paper, and some further advances that we would like to cover with new research. The first conclusion is the mediating role of vulnerability in the climate change conflict nexus, and I think this is very, very important and overlooked by the literature. The results clearly point out the relevance of vulnerability to climate change, both in terms of likelihood and severity, at least for sub-Saharan Africa. A second conclusion is about the use of different regional settings to test the hypothesis, because we clearly found that regional context matters. Because on the other hand, South and Southeast Asia suggests that current climate variability has a greater effect on communal violence outbreaks rather than vulnerability to climate change. So we have a major implication from this point. Testing hypothesis on a regional context, which may be, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. 70% of studies, 60% of studies in the conflict literature are about sub-Saharan Africa. Makes sense according to the incidence of the phenomenon, as I was explaining before. But at the same time, we can't generalize the results we obtain in sub-Saharan Africa to all other regions, because other regions may have different characteristics leading to different results. And this is an example of that. A third conclusion is about the opportunity cost mechanism that we found being active in this case, according to our interpretation, because greater access to productive means and livelihood essentials, which is what we measured by agricultural land per capita, measured according to the rural population sites, this element is consistently associated with a reduction of the likelihood and severity of communal violence. And also from this point, we can derive several policy implications. What is not focused or not covered by this study? First of all, the institutional framework is not well assessed, and how access to resources is regulated matters in the context of growing climate insecurity. And this is exactly the core idea that my colleague Raul Caruso and we are trying to assess on a new research study, a new paper we are working in, how institutional settings mediate under climate insecurity on the effects on communal violence. This is a country-based analysis which makes sense according to the proxies that we are using. Vulnerability intended as the exposure of a country and ability to react to the effects of climate change. However, subnational analyses are also needed to disentangle mechanisms at the local level. Further advances needed, I think, is that internationalized intrastate disputes are not sufficiently reflected in research. If you think about, for example, to communal violence, many groups, also the ones I was citing before, such as Turkana, they cross borders to find livelihood essentials such as pastors. So we have to take into account also this internationalized dimension of disputes over natural resources. And finally, the other side of the coin. We can say that, and many other papers have found similar results, that effective and legitimate natural resources management, including adaptation efforts, can catalyze, can improve climate action and peace building, reducing instability. Because if we increase adaptation, vulnerability is reduced, and therefore the impacts of climate change on instability. But what is the empirical evidence about that? This is an open question. So I think this is something that can be really interesting for future efforts of applied research. And that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer to all your questions.
Okay, thank you. I believe, Dr. Austin, you have the floor now to ignite some discussion with Professor Balessi, please.
And may I share my screen?
I believe you can.
Okay. There, you can see my slide, yes? Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. This is a very important subject. I'm glad to also hear that you have ongoing projects, and especially on institutional approaches. Most of all of my research is on institutions, so a lot of my comments are going to be institutional based. So please, I apologize if things that I'm going to say you've already been thinking about. I'm sure many of them are. Hopefully you can find something in here that is going to be useful. I also really like that this study provides nuance in that regional contexts do not necessarily translate to other contexts. That's a very important point. That's something that's clearly, I think that's something that we can take away from your results or your findings, that there are differences here. And I think those differences are going to extend in many different ways. I mean, what one institution means in one context could be very different in a different region. That could also be true for social institutions and many things. So I really like that you have the nuance already, a sensitivity to the nuance of regions. This whole field or subfield has so much opportunity for theory building and additional research. So it's very exciting. I'm very happy to have listened to your presentation and to be commenting on your paper. And thank you again for being with us today. So I tried to basically structure my comments similar to the structure of the paper. I firstly try to talk about the overview of scholarship on climate change and conflict, as well as some thoughts for potential pathways that could be investigated if they're not being investigated already. And then I'll make some comments on the paper itself, knowing full well that this is a published paper, so congratulations for that. Maybe if you find some of my comments are useful, then maybe you can think of applying them in future work. So first, pathways for climate change and conflicts. as the speaker said, there are resource availability and competition, as well as reduced agricultural productivity. These are particular mechanisms for agriculture and food, which just makes sense. As was stated in the presentation, migration could be an additional secondary pathway. And I was trying to think about, theoretically, hypothetically, finance could also be a secondary pathway. So, for instance, yes, groups might be fighting over resources, but then if, say, a government or a group is losing a resource and that the funding for that resource was vital for some other reason, I guess that is kind of a conflict, or I guess that is kind of a resource-based initial mechanism. But I was thinking that possibly the secondary pathway could be through finance, just as migration could be a secondary pathway for different other types of limitations or scarcities. But I'm not 100% sure on that. When you start thinking about finance, if you're talking about communal groups and communal violence, that's probably a more direct, the mechanism is probably more directly on the individuals. But if you're thinking about group-based finance and governments, you're probably, I don't think climate change is at a point in which it's impacting finance to the point that governments are going to fight. It makes maybe more sense at the communal level that mechanisms are more direct and not necessarily for finance yet. Other pathways. You mentioned institutional pathways. So I've thought also about institutions here. I think distinguishing the income levels of states, and maybe that is a good proxy for state capacity. There's lots of different empirical measures for state capacity out there, but I would think that, especially when you're talking about communal violence, you're talking about groups that are going to be impacted more heavily by changes in the environment. And we would think that countries with higher state capacity are going to have the ability to maybe help move farmers to a new area, or provide food in tough times, or help manage natural resources better. If the institutions are better, then the conflicts shouldn't be happening as much. And I think economic development could proxy for that. I'm sure you're also already thinking about democratic versus authoritarian institutions. That's a very clear one that would be interesting to distinguish. There's more nuance than just simple democracy and dictatorship. For instance, is it a closed authoritarian regime in which the regime doesn't really have a feedback mechanism to know what the population wants and how upset they are, versus maybe an electoral authoritarian regime that's still oppressive, still with the dictatorship, but if they have some kind of electoral mechanism for legislatures or something that provides some amount of feedback. So there is nuance in these types of institutions. Also, decentralized versus centralized, especially in the developing world, especially in weak state environments. The differences between centralization and decentralization can have drastic effects and drastic implications. My research currently is on this subject in particular, and there's good variation across centralized unitary states and federal states in both the sub-Saharan Africa as well as South and Southeast Asia. So I would be very interested to, and the mechanisms I think could be interesting to think about theoretically. Is a decentralized government better at adapting to climate change because it's already more responsive? Decentralization might mean weaker resource capacity generally, but the responsiveness might be more important than the resource capacity of having centralization. I think these are probably open questions. I really like that you're studying communal violence. I think that's appropriate, especially that you're talking about vulnerable groups. These are groups that also rely heavily on social institutions. So I think social institutions could also be maybe a path for mitigating. I think in your talk, you were already kind of mentioning something similar. I don't need to really talk about global systemic things. My point was communal violence is a great first place to start, because if we're talking about country level violence, then we're probably already talking about systemic problems. And maybe that happens one day, hopefully not. And maybe it's already happened, I don't know. But I think communal violence is is the first and best place to start. In addition to conflict as an outcome, I think climate change does create risks for democratic decline, especially in weak states. Democracy, even though different people within the literature have different opinions, in general, democracy is viewed as a product of economic well-being. That having more resources allows people to overcome scarcity problems, which can create opportunities for democratic governance. It doesn't necessarily always follow, but resource scarcity, and once societies have to fight more over the resources they have and the distribution of those resources, that just naturally encourages some groups to take over the state to control resources. We might already be seeing that, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not sure if that's the case, but we've had 6 or 7 countries fail in the last 5 years in sub-Saharan Africa. So look, democratic decline is something I think needs to be on the radar of climate studies. Okay, switching to the empirical side. I really like the descriptive analysis, and in fact, I would like more. Even in my own work, when I was reading your paper, I thought, I need to do this. I also need to do this more. So I'm making the comment that, yeah, please give us more of that. But it's a comment for myself too, that we don't always have good descriptive analyses before we test our models. We usually just run to the test, but the context of the descriptive analyses and the descriptive data are very important to verify that the scope conditions in which your argument is being made it holds. It's also just useful for theory building to show that, okay, if things are really truly different between two places. So I really liked the descriptive analyses. One comment about the events, I think it would be useful to have when you do the descriptive analysis in particular, have the events proportional to population. If you're doing cross comparisons, I think that would just be, it would make it easier for us to be able to compare what the outcome is in a big country versus the outcome in a smaller country. And then I have some empirical based questions that are directly about the paper. Again, the paper is published, so my comments aren't that useful, but maybe you can consider some of my thoughts for future work. I didn't think, well, let me say in terms of covariates, the general comment is because relationships could go in multiple directions, I would have liked to have seen models that, and even just if it's an appendix, I would like to have seen models that vary which covariates are in the model and which aren't, as a means of indicating, showing that model results aren't necessarily tied to a particular model design. And sometimes they could be, because covariates do matter, which covariate you include and don't, especially for observational data, has a big, it's highly important. But one covariate in particular that I want to pick on is the GDP growth. Because of potential for reverse causality and colliding, including GDP growth could be putting the model at risk of type 1 errors. Secondly, you have a lag for GDP growth because you're trying to avoid the reverse causality there. And in my understanding, lags are generally not sufficient for trying to account or trying to control for when the potential for reverse causality, because the temporal processes are correlated. So then that means using the lag of your outcome could just be an instrument for your outcome. So it's not, in my opinion, let me say it that way. In my opinion, lagging potential reverse causality covariates isn't sufficient. In my opinion, I would rather see models that just don't include them. I also tend to ascribe to the view that lag-dependent variables typically do more harm than good. They can be useful in context, but it's not always clear what that context is. There's recent literature on this subject. I generally don't like the lag-dependent variables, as you can tell, but that's my 2 cents. So for me, as a reader of your research, even if it's in an appendix, you drop the lag coefficients just so I can say, okay, the results aren't dependent on that particular model design. I would, as a reader, I appreciate it. Then a couple more comments on model estimation. As I already said, please report, even if it's an appendix, report various covariates. The controls that you have, including, so you've got the negative rainfall, the forests, and the agricultural land. And I find that these, you refer to them as controls, and I understand that they can serve as controls for the vulnerability. I also appreciate that you selected controls that are intentionally not part of the vulnerability index. For instance, you talk about the rainfall as a short term, whereas the vulnerability is looking more aggregate rain or aggregate water as a resource. So I appreciate that a lot, but I also kind of really like the controls as explanatory variables. In particular, rainfall. Rainfall is something that's naturally occurring. It's going to be impacted by climate change. It's, as you were mentioning in your talk, these types of short-term changes. In my opinion, the short-term types of changes are a much more reliable means of getting or of estimating or testing your hypotheses. And I say this because I'm going to pick on the vulnerability index for a second. Which I know this isn't like you didn't build the vulnerability index. I understand you're using it because it's a useful thing, but it is so broad that, in my opinion, it's not clear what it's actually representing. There's a whole lot of things and I also very much appreciate that you have in the appendix, you list which of the 6 main indicators are in the vulnerability index. But even those indicators, those are composed of lots of other things, including one of the things that it includes is the predicted number of deaths due to climate change. If I understand this vulnerability index correct, one of the inputs is a prediction of the number of deaths due to climate change, which I think is troubling if you're going to use that index for predicting events of conflict. Because you're already, like, someone is, if I'm understanding the measure correctly and the input correctly, that's taking some kind of information that's predicting your outcome, and then you're using that as your explanatory variable. I think for my purpose, I would prefer that you take apart the vulnerability index, and because you're already thinking about pathways. So I think if you take apart the index, you can be much more nuanced in how you establish theoretical pathways, and that can lead to much clearer tests of what you're exactly representing. And then, so on pathways, I suggest that in future work, you pair background conditions, like such as things that are in the vulnerability index that can be an indication of initial vulnerability to climate change, but then utilize different types of shocks, especially short-term shocks, as you mentioned. Those, especially if they're naturally occurring, or at least orthogonal to the background condition, then you can get a good test of what happens if the background condition is very poor. This is a highly vulnerable group, and we identify that by this background condition. What happens if some shock happens? Like, say, there happens to be a bad crop year for some reason. What happens to the people in that year? Well, I think in that way you can find better evidence in support of specific causal pathways. I think that would be much more informative than if you just use this blunt tool of the vulnerability index. I think the vulnerability index does a job, but because you're already thinking about something that's more specific theoretically, I think you need a more theoretical, mixing words. I think you need a more theoretically specified estimation. And as you mentioned that you're interested to, of course, to look at more local level data. Of course, especially for sample sizes, that's necessary. But I would just want to suggest also potentially survey experiments, what, say, farmers would do if they were posed with a question about some particular event. That's a lot harder to try to test for conflict. I mean, you can't necessarily ask people, hey, when would you attack your neighbor? So I recognize there's major limitations there, but thank you very much for your talk. I think I talked way over, so I apologize for that. I look forward to the rest of the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Austin, for your comments. Let me know if I go through these comments or if there are questions from the floor.
There are a few questions from the floor, so maybe I would ask Dr. Balessi to kind of prioritize the ones that will really translate your main message. So both from comments from Dr. Austin, and then I can also resume the questions from the floor. But I think you can start with a few comments on the discussant.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments, because they are really, really focused on the key paths that I've tried to describe today in this talk. Let's say a lot of food for thought for even further research activities. I have not enough time to go through all the points raised by the discussant, but I would like to say something about, for example, the conditionalities of vulnerability. We assess the role of this index removing the GDP, exactly because the index itself somehow includes the economic status of the countries, because the adaptive capacity reflects the economic development status of a country. So somehow this is reflected in the index itself. And we tried our models removing the GDP per capita growth that we use to see the overall trend of the economic path of these countries, and results were consistent. I found really interesting your comment about democratic versus autocratic institutions. There is much debate if more democratic institutions can serve really in reducing this kind of violence or not, in the sense that I made the example about some groups in the north western area of Kenya, well, these groups are very similar to the ones living in the eastern region of Uganda. These areas are under the same climatic pressures. However, Kenya is impacted a lot by communal violence and not Uganda. What is the reason why we observe so different effects? Well, one answer could be institutions. In Uganda, there is an autocratic regime mirrored by formal democratic institutions, and the control of the territory is really, really strong. So we can think a lot about the role of institutions in driving this kind of effects. And also the last point about centralized versus decentralized institutions is very important. And this is something we are trying to include in the new paper we are working on. This is exactly what we are trying to do. What about this index? Yeah, I agree with you. This is a composite, an aggregate index, including several elements. And maybe distinguishing between exposure, sensitivity, and adaptation can serve to understand mechanisms, but I'm not pretty agree with this perspective in the sense that vulnerability is the result of the interaction of these three elements. So if you want to measure vulnerability, you have to look at all these dimensions. If you want to see what is the effect of adaptation capacity, yes, I agree. We have to unpack this kind of indexes. However, this paper is not about causal inference, is more about understanding what is possible systematic association between vulnerability and communal violence. So this is the reason why we decided to use the whole index to see if there are patterns of associations between the two. I have a lot of other comments to make, but I think it's time to hear the questions from the floor.
Yeah, so I will give space if any of the participants want to voice their questions by unmuting. I will give chance for one question. Otherwise, I will read from the Q&A chat, but please, if you can interact, would be great. Any questions from the audience? Okay, so in the Q&A box, we have a few questions, but I believe the third one, if the person can go through professor's paper, maybe they can find the answer. But maybe I will select where can we place biodiversity losses besides agriculture? So when we talk about biodiversity losses, where can we place it besides agriculture?
This is a very interesting question. It applies to several dimensions, but please consider that when we say agriculture, we use the FAO definition of agriculture. So it's everything related to cultivations, but also livestock activities and something like that. So it's a broad category, including basically the primary sector. Okay, the most important economic activities in the primary sector. Biodiversity affects oceans, so all the activities carried out along the coasts. Think about fishermen communities and this kind of activities. It affects forests. And we use, for example, in this paper, the share of forested areas with respect to the total area of the country as a control, because we would like to see what is the effect of these land use forests, since we interpreted this variable as a source of livelihoods for these kind of groups, these specific kind of groups, communal groups. So if climate change affects also forests, a loss of biodiversity is perceived also in how forests develop, and the effects can be perceived by also this kind of groups. Maybe we can also, the first question, I don't know,
Yes,
how can we draw a line between civil and armed conflicts? Okay, this is about the operative definitions that are applied. Usually, in both cases, we are talking about so-called battle-related violence. So we have at least two groups. One of them can be the state of a country or a group representing the government, but you need at least two groups, okay? A civil conflict is defined in this way. So two groups within a country. It is an armed conflict have a minimum threshold of 1,000 related death is recorded in 1 year. So this is the main difference we use. This is according a specific definition, which is the one applied by the UCDP. Then there are others, datasets using different definitions. So once again, what kind of data you use matters in what you are observing and analyzing. This is a main issue to be aware of.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for your patience for staying with us longer. I would invite all the participants to engage with Professor Ballestri through her research with the papers and with the presentation. Please, this webinar was recorded, so we will eventually find this video in our YouTube page. And I would like to close this session thanking the speaker, Dr. Ballestri, and the discussant, Dr. Austin, and of course, our participants. And yes, so please continue to join our webinars and find out more about NERPS through our social media pages. Thank you for today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. It has been really a pleasure for me.